Thank you all for coming, whoever has trekked out here. I'm going to make a short introduction and then we'll move on to the speakers. I'm Zulekha Chaudhary from the Alkazi Theatre Archives at the Alkazi Foundation for the Arts, New Delhi. The Theatre Archives at the Foundation was initiated in 2016 with the exhibition The Theatre of E. Alkazi, which opened at the Lalit Kala Galleries, New Delhi, as well as the NGMA Mumbai and the Jawahar Kala Kendra, Jaipur. Theatre, like any other performance practice, has a short lifespan, that of its durée. Liveness cannot be grasped as data. What remains of a performance are the techniques, mechanics, concepts, and histories that inform the practice of theatre as well as the traces of the final performance itself, photographs, videos, notes, and critical writing. But these only gesture to the memory of the event, even as its performative moment remains inaccessible and which is antithetical to the idea of the archive. Theatre, in a sense, is a constantly vanishing activity that stands on the precipice of the archive. While the Alkazi Theatre Archives contains material from post-independence modern theatre in India, it believes that a dialogue with contemporary practices allows for a telescopic view of how historical contexts and legacies of theatre practices have informed different theatre content and form, allowing us to trace historical chronologies, ideologies, methods, processes as a map that is complex, networked, and hypertextual. Collecting Practices is an umbrella program of the Alkazi Theatre Archives, foregrounding the histories, processes, and conceptual formulations of making in performance. Collecting Practices 1 and 2, which were in 2016 and 17, focused on documenting the informal and embodied discourses of artistic practice, concentrating on acting methodologies and ideologies. Collecting Practices 3, Rehearsing the Nation, is a series of 3 talks considering theatre as a lens to read multiple histories. Each talk in the current series is associated with a production at Black Box Okhla in the next 6 to 7 months. Today's talk, Culture History Theory, is with Anita Cherian and Brahma Prakash, which refracts off Nikhil Mehta's performance for the record. The time seems out of joint. Economical disasters, outrageous social imbalance, growing right-wing populism, millions of people forced into migration, various religious fundamentalisms, and unprecedented ecological catastrophes to come. Who is representing whom, in which way, and with what right? These questions are addressed to political systems but can be asked of theatre itself. Though participation in art and politics is not always pleasant, the belief that one can take part in shaping society is a necessity for democracy. Does contemporary theatre have to put itself right in the middle of this dilemma, not only avoiding false or perceived participation, but at the same time reclaiming the idea of participation as such? A participation that doesn't merely replace one mode of tutelage with another. As Claire Bishop pointed out in her essay Antagonism and Relational Asthetics, participation should create a sense of unease and discomfort rather than belonging. Treating all involved as subjects of independent thought is the essential prerequisite for political action. The question of participation is necessarily linked to the question of representation. Everyone participating in theatre, as an actor, as a performer, as a spectator or audience, is also automatically understood as representing a larger community distinguished by color, sex, class, profession, and so on. Therefore, the questions that currently haunt all democracies, who is being represented in which way, by whom, and with what right, are mirrored in the theatre. Can a bourgeois actor represent a refugee? Can the West represent the global South? Can a man represent a woman? Is the representation of colonial cliches a demasking or just a repetition of a degrading insult. As much as theatre can be a space of collective or collaboration imagination, it has also always been a medium for showing conflicts and oppositions between ideas, powers, nations, generations, couples, or even within the psyche of a single character. Chantal Mouffe stresses in the democratic paradox, while we desire an end to conflict, if we want people to be free, we must always allow for the possibility that conflict may appear and to provide an arena where differences can be confronted. Mouffe's concept of agonistic pluralism therefore aims for democracy to be an arena in which we can act out our differences as adversaries without having to reconcile them. At a time in which the dictum, who is not with us is against us, is having a renaissance on all sides of the political spectrum, do we need a playful but serious agonism where contradictions are not only kept alive, but above all can be freely articulated? Art, using a differentiation by art theorist Mi-Won Kwon, not in but as public space, may be one of the most important things that theatre can offer. It is in the public sphere that theatre and citizenship converge, where we can question ourselves as products of ideologies, politics, times, fashions, and circumstances, performing a citizen who is multivalent, hybrid, and unsettled, thereby seeking dynamic forms of cultural expression. Can theatre be a powerful medium of not only mirroring society, but being a part of changing it, without imperatively looking at the role and influence of national institutions with regards to values accorded by cultural establishments? Within the complex dialectic of inclusion and exclusion, how the naming, collecting, preserving, and exhibiting of select subject matter that is institutionally affirmed is elevated to iconic or near hagiographic status, thus swiftly making permanent national, in quotes, cultural property, often valorized beyond dissent and critique, at times as incontrovertible as an edict, and at times fraught with identity politics, a national, again in quotes, performance canon and a national, in quotes, discourse of representation sets a precedent, shapes and reinforces a particular tradition, and serves as a permanent index of state-approved worth, validity, and standards for future generations of viewers and practitioners. In this production of the national and the anti-national, the mainstream and the margin, the question is, perhaps, who rehearses the nation and for whom? The first speaker today is Anita Cherian. She has a PhD in performance studies from the Tisch School of the Arts, New York University. Her research interests are in the areas of cultural policy and cultural studies, cultural labor, literary history, theatre history, and performance studies. Her publications have appeared in journals such as The Third Frame, Sangeet Natak, Interventions, and the International Journal of Folklore Studies. She is currently the Associate Professor in Literary Art at the School of Culture and Creative Expressions, Ambedkar University. Anita's presentation is titled The First Drama Seminar Report, Imagining a National Theatre, Institutional Reorganization, and the Mobilizing of Theatrical Pasts, which revisits the Sangeet Natak Academy organized drama seminar of 1956. It also revisits a paper based on this text that was published a few years ago. The proceedings of the first drama seminar of 1956 remained unpublished for several decades, though they were first available, roughly collated in a volume called the First Drama Seminar Report. The FDSR, this talk central concern, compiles the 52 presentations made at the drama seminar by gathering experts who had, in quotes, devoted the best part of their lives to make Indian drama what it is today, end quotes. Her presentation has two primary objectives: to examine the modes through which the FDSR constructs, which is recovers and revisions the history of pre-independence theatre in India, and to evaluate the terms through which it imagines and institutes a national theatre for the nation's post-colonial future. These are related exercises signaling the post-colonial nation-state's arrival into modernity. I'm going to also introduce Brahma Prakash so we can go from one to the other. So the second speaker is Dr. Brahma Prakash, who is an assistant professor of theatre and performance studies at the School of Arts and Asthetics, JNU. He is the author of the recently published book, Cultural Labour, Conceptualizing the Folk Performance in India, which is from Oxford University Press. His talk is called Framing the Folk and Rehearsing the Nation, the Pitfalls of Institutional Theatres in India. Aloysius' Nationalism Without a Nation from 1997 underlines the problem through which the crisis of national theatre, or for that matter, Indian theatre, could be analysed in India. Bereft of a common language and aspiration, the nation was rehearsed in idioms of folk, where the forms were altered and narrated against the backdrop of nationalistic discourse. It was not only the nation, but the folk, which was also framed in this cultural process. Against this background, the talk will discuss the limits of theatre and the crisis of language of elite theatres in India to pose any challenge to ongoing neoliberal cultural onslaughts. Thank you both for agreeing to be part of this talk. Anita, would you like to come here?
Thank you so much, Zulekha and Black Box Theatre, for inviting me. It's given me an opportunity to go back to work that I keep saying I will go back to and rarely ever do. It's what I'm going to do today is part of a very long paper, but I'm going to look at about 12 pages of that. I will read because I don't want to take up too much time, more than I will in any case. Okay, so I start with a couple of quotations that serve as an epigraph to the article, and the first is by this person called Narayan Kale, who was this Marathi theatre director, a very, very big personality. So he says, we have to remember while trying to reorganize our professional theatre that our new theatre must be thoroughly national and popular in character. In our attempts at building up this national theatre, we must make maximum use of indigenous material from our national heritage, and its foundations must be firmly laid in our national traditions. So that's Narayan Kale. And then there's Balraj Sahni, who says, today our dramatic art stands on the threshold of a new birth. And both of these people are saying this in 1956. So the first section, introducing the drama seminar. The Sangeet Natak Academy organized the drama seminar in April 1956. It was the second of a series organized by the Academy following its inception. The first was the film seminar of 1955, and the last, the dance seminar of 1958. Perceived as critical activities, the seminars were conceptualized as a central part of the Academy's long-term development planning. The drama seminar's principal concern was with the delineation of the future Indian drama. This is evident from the first chapter of the report. I'm going to call it the FTSR. In its opening address, the seminar's director, Sachin Sengupta, referenced the Academy chairman, Dr. P.V. Rajamannar, with a query regarding what the future Indian drama should be like. The seminar, Sengupta suggests, represented the Academy's efforts to find it, that is, Indian drama, for him. Sengupta's address reveals the characteristic discomfort of the artist encountering the institution. The Academy's response to Rajamannar's directive was therefore neither that of a bureaucratic body nor of one so foolish as to issue any directive on the subject. In most of these places I'm quoting. In lieu of these, a decision was made to gather the opinions of experts who have devoted the best part of their lives to make Indian drama what it is today. The seminars for the performing arts, organized by the Academy, had in Sengupta's opinion a function quite distinct from that of the academic variant. Their significance lay in the fact that any relevant analysis demanded the interpellation of their institutional conditions of possibility. Sengupta argues that the arts required for their fulfillment immediate response from their patrons as well as their sustained support. Seminars relating to these arts should therefore seek the contact of their connoisseurs as far as practicable. This statement alludes to both the transitions and structures of patronage for the performing arts and the dynamics of connoisseurship, suggesting the historically contingent relationship between the social standing of patrons, performers, and the arts themselves. Sengupta's invocation of the connoisseur references neither the feudal patron, a symbol of political and economic structures rapidly rendered redundant, nor the corporate sponsor. He hails instead the amateur lover of the theatre, affirming the rationality and reformism of middle-class tastes and representing them as normative. Such a sensibility is reflected in the seminar's participants, all of whom were characterized as the very best in the field, who could offer the gathering the full benefit of their wisdom and experience. The vast majority of the participants worked in the amateur theatre and shared a bracing contempt for the commercial stage. The opportunity to participate in the seminar was an honor conferred on the nation's theatre enthusiasts by the Academy. Participation signaled not only the Academy's recognition of the participants' prior contributions, it also placed on them the onus of delineating the contours of the national theatre to come. A majority of the seminar's participants were soon key figures as directors, playwrights, actors, heads of national institutions, cultural administrators, ideologues and critics, national award winners, fellows of the SNA, who determined significant trends in the Indian theatre's post-1950s development. The seminar lasted 6 days and brought together eminent theatre experts from all over the world. The report, however, remained unpublished for nearly 5 decades, till 2004, when the Academy published it in its journal. A striking aspect of the FDSR's organization is its desire to both replicate the linguistic restructuring of the nation state and to present a range of thematic concerns relevant to the imminent theatre. Since national representation was a key concern, a concerted effort was made to bring together participants representing the linguistic and cultural diversity, the nation's linguistic and cultural diversity. The 52 papers submitted to the steering committee examined the various facets of Indian drama. So they had a whole bunch of thematic questions such as folk drama, opera and ballet, Indian drama, etc. Though the language presentations followed one after the other in alphabetical order, beginning with Assamese and concluding with the Tamil and Telugu theatres of the former Madras Presidency, we see one noteworthy exception, that of the Sanskrit theatre. In a gesture indicating an origin for the authentic Indian theatre, a history of the Sanskrit theatre was the first of the presentations to follow the introductory speeches. Also of significance were the theatrical forms that did not find mention. The Parsi theatre and the Ipta were significantly not seen as subjects meriting consideration through individual papers. Both these areas, particularly the former, figure largely in the papers and the discussions that followed. The latter, despite its very recent history, that is, the Ipta 1943-48, remained a subject introduced perforce into discussions where bare mention was made of its contribution. This essay attempts to examine the modes through which the FDSR constructs the history of pre-independence theatre in India, and thereafter to evaluate the terms through which it imagines and institutes a national theatre for the nation's post-colonial future. These, needless to say, are related exercises signaling the post-colonial nation-state's arrival into modernity. A critical impulse motivating the seminar's discussions is the discovery of a legitimate Indian theatrical tradition. The seminar's understanding of tradition reiterates national narratives about India's spiritual unity, which transcended, in Sengupta's terms, the apparent differences in languages, customs, manners, social orders, and political setups. Such nostalgia asserts that India's soul had remained constant, notwithstanding the determinations of the governmental and institutional structures of colonialism. The papers presented at the seminar reveal pervasive doubts about the quality of existing Indian drama. It would appear that these concerns about quality were in fact concerns about the Indian or national character of recent theatre in India. The FDSR, importantly, was perhaps the first document produced under the aegis of the sovereign state to articulate concerns relating to the idea of the national theatre. Its reiterated desire for a theatre history consistent with the realized national present transforms its presentations and their proposals for the future into a document akin to policy. So I kind of go into the next section, which is called the prehistories of a national theatre, and I will be looking briefly at two theatres, the Bengali theatre and the Parsi theatre. And like I've said before, the FDSR does not really document the Parsi theatre, but I kind of interpolate the Parsi theatre, and you'll see why. The FDSR devotes 3 chapters to the Bengali theatre. These include Dr. Amar Mukherjee's essay on the Bengali drama and theatre, Leela Ray's discussion of the plays of Tagore, and the actor Ohindra Chaudhary's presentation of the professional theatre in Bengal. In striking contrast, the Parsi theatre, which had since the 1850s constituted vibrant forums for public entertainments across the subcontinent, did not warrant a single paper. Instead, we find that the Parsi theatre makes its appearance either as the stigmatized commercial other to various vernacular theatres seeking the stamp of authenticity, or alternately as appropriated by the vernacular, thereby constituting the heritage of theatre in that language. Often, as in the presentations on Gujarati, Hindi, Marathi, Kannada, Andhra, Tamil, Telugu, Bengali, and even the Manipuri theatre, we see both these processes working together. Here, clearly, the appropriation of this form that characteristically exceeded its linguistic connections to Gujarati or Hindustani or Urdu was achieved so seamlessly that it became the singular patrimony of several other languages. Another point to be kept in mind while reading the FDSR's representations of the Bengali and Parsi theatre is that of its alignment of the former with projects of nationalism and religious reform, and of the latter with its inauthentic hybrid colonial antecedents. The FDSR's history of the Bengali theatre erases the necessary trace of its institution at the intersections of the encounter between forms of Bengali culture and British colonialism. As Homi Bhabha points out, this is the margin of hybridity, where cultural differences contingently and conflictually touch. Projects attempting to institute a national theatre have been an integral part of histories of several nation states. Such aspirations signal a landmark moment in their desire for self-representation, with the theatre representing a nation's integrity to itself. Loren Kruger suggests that this notion of staging the nation, of representing as well as reflecting the people in the theatre, of constituting or even standing in for an absent or even imperfect national identity, first emerged during the European Enlightenment and took concrete shape with the revolutionary fetes. Applied to the context of colonial India, however, Kruger's criteria for theatrical nationhood, of mass national politics and universal suffrage appear deeply problematic. The rule of colonial difference ensured that the colonized were not allowed the emancipatory space of nationalism as mass movement, as bourgeois revolution, or universal suffrage. Instead, as Ranajit Guha and Partha Chatterjee have shown, Indian nationalism articulated itself as a mediatory project wherein the elite and middle class, urged to hegemony in relation to other subaltern colonial classes, took the form of a universalism expressed inevitably as nationalism. So very quick whatever of the Bengal theatre. In Calcutta, the first Bengali play was staged in 1795 at a theatre established by the Russian adventurer Gerasim Lebedev. Okay, so just one point that I want to make here, that my reconstructions are based on the narratives that are available in the first Rama Seminar report. This was a short-lived endeavor, with the theatre closing after Lebedev's departure from the city. The next significant moment was the 1831 opening of the Hindu theatre by the rich landlord Prasanna Kumar Tagore at his garden house near Calcutta. The practice of constructing European-style theatres in the residences of rich landlords and moneylenders continued till the 1860s. As a consequence of this, the theatre became the chosen form of private entertainment for the respectable gentry who carefully vetted their invited audiences. During this period, the plays most favored for performances were commissioned Bengali translations of ancient Sanskrit classic, classics, Shakespeare, and newer plays written in the heroic mode. The first original Bengali play was written in 1852 and performed soon after. Performances by amateur troupes became customary after the 1850s, the widespread formation of dramatic clubs representing every community, town, and locality. By the 1870s, alongside the emergent nationalist movement, changes were becoming apparent in the social base of patronage of the Bengali theatre. These transitions indicated an inclination towards nationalism and political organizing among the Bhadralok, a significant shift from its earlier collaborationist relationship with the colonial rulers. Also signaled were shifts in the class base of the theatre, with increasing numbers of the professional middle classes forming their own troupes. Among the most significant of these were the Bengal Theatre and the Great National Theatre. Bengali theatre came into its own as a public institution only after the establishment of the Great National Theatre in 1872 by Girish Chandra Ghosh. The National Theatre was the earliest Indian attempt to constitute a theatrical organization claiming the name of the national. The inception of the public theatre radically transformed perceptions about stagecraft, viewership, publicness, and mass access to the modern economies of entertainment and media. Historically allied with the Bengali middle classes, the professional theatre provided an unprecedented forum where the pressing political and social questions of the time could be addressed. Ohindra Chowdhury, in his essay The Professional Theatre, claims that the theatre was not only a centre of attraction for amusements and entertainments, but exerted a tremendous influence as an educational agency. The new accessibility of the theatre made it a significant factor in urban sociality to the possibilities of interaction it offered to vast cross-sections of the populace. Among the crowds flocking to the theatre were lawyers, judges, intellectuals, artists, students, shopkeepers, and after the late 1880s, the Viceroy, the Governor of Bengal, and even visiting English royalty. Theatre-going, Chowdhury tells us, was central to the experience of the city, with visitors from the Mofassal areas combining trips to the theatre with activities such as those of pilgrimage. After the imposition of the Dramatic Performances Act in 1876, the theatre became a site for a Hindu revivalism that masked a burgeoning cultural nationalism. The FDSR conveys the impression that there was never amidst the Bengali middle classes a movement opposing the professional theatre or its commercial inclinations. Such a structure of representation contrasts with the intensifying opposition to the commercial theatre elsewhere in India. From the work of Sudipta Chatterjee and Rimli Bhattacharya, however, we discern a somewhat different picture. The Bengali theatre, though immensely popular with middle-class audiences, was hardly devoid of conflict. Debates on the moral correctness of the practice of the theatre, particularly with regard to the employment of women from the prostitute class as actresses portraying the virtuous Bhadramahila, provoked discussion, ambivalence, and on occasion tore apart professional relationships. Bhattacharya points out that the public theatre, notwithstanding its Bhadralok identity, depended on the labour of the prostitute actresses, who were first recruited in August 1873, barely a year after the formation of Girish Ghosh's National Theatre in December 1872. I will suggest that this information is relevant for the light it sheds on the narrative strategies employed at the drama seminar. The FDSR quite clearly acts upon a desire to homogenize histories of the Bengali theatre, creating as a result the ideal institutional model for both the vernacular and the national theatres in the post-independence period. However, the commercial and critical success of the Bengali theatre needs to be recognized as a distinctive phenomenon whose conditions of possibility derive from Bengal's colonial history and consequently Calcutta's development as a metropolitan centre, the restructuring of castes and classes as a corollary of colonial intervention, the collaboration of the middle and upper classes with colonial governmental projects, exposure to colonial education, the emergence of English as the language of bureaucracy and intellectual influence for a new Bengali elite, the refurbishing of Bengali as a modern language adequate to the task of representing a modern culture, the state's relative linguistic homogeneity, and finally the reform and nationalist movements that delineated the sovereign construct of an Indian nation. An analysis of the Parsi theatre in relation to the demands of the national will remain incomplete without a contextualization of the geographic, social, and economic conditions for its emergence and consolidation. While Calcutta was the administrative seat of British India until its capital was shifted to New Delhi, Bombay, British India's most vital port, was the commercial hub of empire and attracted to its shore a multi-ethnic and multilingual population. The Parsi theatre developed alongside the decline of court culture and its patronage system, and the corresponding growth of Bombay's wealth and power as a metropolis. Catherine Hansen points out that from the outset, the city nurtured a heterogeneous population comprising Parsis, Banias, a minority of English citizens, Marathis, Gujaratis, Armenians, Arabs, Jews, Malays, and Indian citizens. Unsurprisingly, the city's cultural heterogeneity was manifest in the heterogeneous practices of the Parsi theatre. I will suggest that this quality was in many ways at odds with nationalism's homogenizing and centralizing impulses. If in relation to the Bengali theatre, my effort was to reveal the context within which it came to exemplify a national theatre, my intention vis-a-vis the Parsi theatre is to reflect upon why, despite its overwhelming popularity, linguistic flexibility, and pan-Indian, in fact pan-Asian circulation, it was not thought to be a theatrical style worthy of the name of the national. One possible reason for this could be the hybrid modes of its articulation, visible in its deformations and displacements of language, this is Bhaba, performance strategies and narrative content, refusal of the classical unities, use of all available stage technologies, territorial and linguistic mobility, and the ethnic and religious identities of the directors and financiers. The FTSR presents the history of the Parsi theatre through the work of theatre historians and practitioners asserting regional vernacular identities. Ignored as a subject meriting an individual paper, it is only through presentations dealing with the Marathi, Gujarati, Hindi, and other professional theatres of the Western region that we have access to the Parsi theatre. Visible here is the establishment's refusal to acknowledge the Parsi theatre as an entity that transcended the linguistic, religious, and cultural divides being consolidated alongside the nationalist movement in the latter half of the 19th century. I would argue that the Parsi theatre's hybrid vision of the pan-Indian popular was not a mode, aesthetic or governmental, that the national imaginary was willing to accept as part of its schema. More conducive, perhaps, were claims to the national made via regional forms emerging alongside strengthening vernacular identities. In October 1853, the Parsi Dramatic Corps staged Rustam, Zabuli, and Sohrab. Somnath Gupta informs us that 1854 saw such a series of Gujarati plays by various groups, all with the title Parsi appended to their names, with Parsi themes, characters, and actors, staged at the Grant Road Theatre, that it led one to believe that the Parsi theatre had in fact arrived. The Parsis, who had in the 18th century, through their collaboration with the British, acquired great wealth, became by the middle of the 19th century the new patrons of culture, buying and constructing theatres, establishing drama companies, creating the conditions for the emergence of a new form of popular entertainment. In the initial stages, the nomenclature Parsi established the theatre's intimate ties with the community, referring to the ownership of the companies, the identity of the playwrights, actors, and audience, and the language of playwriting and performance Gujarati. With the form's growing popularity and with the introduction in 1870 of plays in Urdu, new audiences, including Iranis, Muslims, Hindus, and even high-ranking British officials, began to frequent the theatre. A liberal pricing structure for tickets ensured a diverse audience, including large numbers of the working classes. From the 1870s onwards, I'm sure all of you know this, the Parsi theatre begins to kind of actively move around the subcontinent and Asia. And this is because they find the kind of paucity of space in which to perform. Relentlessly inventive in its pursuit of the popular, the Parsi theatre did not hesitate to borrow from a myriad performative, linguistic, and literary sources. It cared little for the artificial boundaries set up between the permeable realms of the folk, the popular, and the classical. We see the evidence of a relentless sifting and juggling of performative idioms in the attempt to produce popular entertainment. This expansive lexicon derived its components from a variety of sources: classical music and dance transiting from a court-supported patronage economy to more scientific middle-class spaces, folk performance forms such as Nautanki, Tamasha, Bhavai that were being squeezed out of urban centers with the advent of the modern theatre, leaving their characteristic imprint on performers and performing styles. The realist and review modes displayed by traveling European theatre groups and reworkings in performance of the iconic articulation characteristic of traditional Indian art. So I have a section on the hybrid, which I will not deal with, but I will in fact go into the next section, which is called the classical and the folk, counterpoints to the hybrid. The FDSR statements on the subject of an aesthetic model for the national theatre seeks to institutionalize practices of authenticity that would replace the inauthentic strategies of the Parsi theatre. Given that this inauthenticity gestured towards the latter's disregard of taste, hierarchy, and national or cultural difference, the utopic national theatre sought to embody authenticity through its investment in classical idioms and in an uncorrupted indigeneity represented in folk and tribal performance. Orientalism and the colonial educational system together constituted the concept of a classical literary canon, the former through its work on Sanskrit and the Indian Golden Age, and the latter through the valorization of English literature. Both these models signaled in different ways the reformist potential of high cultural forms. If the Parsi theatre's reworking of Shakespeare and other canonical European texts reveal the ambivalence and uncertainties of reception, its appropriation of Sanskrit plays like Kalidasa's Shakuntala and its derivations of classical music and dance threaten to undermine the painstakingly established continuities and constancies of the national tradition. The clamour for the classical is in effect a clamour for fixity of origin, for transmission that is controlled rather than dispersed. This perspective provides the context within which we can examine the FDSR's position pieces on classical theatre. So the FDSR has two pieces on classical theatre. One is by the Sanskritist V. Raghavan on Sanskrit theatre, and the other was by a Kuchipudi dancer called Nataraj Ramakrishnan on the Kuchipudi Bhagavatam. Evident in Raghavan and Ramakrishna's essays are two related aspects of the mobilizing of the classical. The former draws upon Sanskrit drama to establish the pan-Indian trans-historical spread of a pre-Islamic golden age. Interestingly, here the classical conveys a delocalized national sensibility that ideologically fuses the fragmented subcontinent. One consequence of this valorization of the national is a provincializing of regional vernacular forms as derivative of the Sanskrit original, or alternately as inferior to it. The latter picks out the seeming remnants of a Sanskritic culture in regional classical forms like Vidhi Bhagavatam, practiced by the Brahmin Pandits of Kuchipudi to affiliate vernacular cultural forms to a national tradition and simultaneously to validate the political and cultural claims to regional autonomy of linguistic communities such as the Telugus of Andhra Desa. Such an example deploys the authority of the classical and its association with notions of antiquity, tradition, and uncorrupted transmission to legitimize the political imperatives of linguistic nationalism. So I go on to suggest that the classical there is a kind of deep investment in the classical because the classical in some senses provides a template for the authority of the state. So the kind of emergence and strengthening of the middle classes is hinged upon a kind of articulation of the power of the classical. The idea of the folk complements that of the classical as an aesthetic counterpoint to the baggy portmanteau style of the Parsi theatre. As I have said elsewhere, the post-colonial nation-state followed the colonial state in its policy of fetishizing the folk tribal through a representational discourse combining anthropological with aesthetic interest. Further, the 1950 institution of the Republic Day Parade and the Folk Dance Festival had made a certain image of the folk that of exotically dressed dancers gambolling down Rajpath in frigid January a part of the national imaginary. Given this, the folk have been a deep-seated part of the visual aesthetic field that signifies the nation. In 1956, the FDSR had two papers devoted to folk performance: Suresh Avasthi's The Hindi Folk Drama and Deena Gandhi's presentation on Bhavai, the Gujarati folk drama. Despite these essays, the FDSR's delineation of the folk conveys that this was not yet an area properly constituted as a subject of metropolitan investigation. Suresh Avasthi, who would in the decades to follow become a doyen of the folk-oriented theatre roots movement, admits as much. The present situation regarding the study of Hindi folk is far from satisfactory. This class of drama has no place in the history of dramatic literature and in academic dramatic studies. Okay, so both Avasthi and Dina Gandhi essentially try to talk about the inadequacies of like folk articulation, and they also kind of come up with a framework that is very familiar to us. One is that the folk and folk articulations are disappearing, therefore they have to be recorded and categorized. Two, they are basically inadequate in both their kind of frameworks of morality and analytics. So this again, the middle class would be able to kind of enter in and fill that gap. So the rest of the paper, which I'm not going to read, is essentially, I look at the way in which the politics of institutional reorganization, and I also look at the way in which an elite middle class comes to be seen as the prime stewards of culture. And so essentially, so you're looking at the kind of cultural cognoscenti that kind of begin to cluster around the institutions that are established in Delhi and elsewhere. And so there is a complete lack of self-consciousness about privilege, about authority, about restrictions of access. And so I think when Zulekha asked me to do this paper, she said what she found interesting was the way in which the debates that are there in this paper are so similar to the debates that we have going on right now. And when I was reading the paper again, I said, oh yes, that is true. But anyway, thank you so much.
Thank you, Anita. For those of you who have come in a bit later, let me just introduce Dr. Brahma Prakash and then we can go into his paper. So Dr. Brahma Prakash is an assistant professor of theatre and performance studies at the School of Arts and Asthetics, JNU, and he is the author of a recently published book, Cultural Labour, Conceptualizing the Folk Performance in India. And I think that his paper, which is called his talk, which is called Framing the Folk and Rehearsing for the Nation, the Pitfalls of Institutional Theatres in India, follows quite well on from where Anita left off.
Yeah, so thank you, Julekha, and thank you, Black Box Theatre, for considering me here as a speaker. Because when Julekha contacted me, then I was quite no, is it sure that she want to invite me? Because no, this is not my area in that way. But later I realized that she was interested in having this dialogue between this whole idea of the folk and this whole idea of the national theatre, or for that matter, what we say Indian theatre. So what I'm going to do, I will make 3-4 points and how I see. So for my work, the way Anita is invested in this whole idea of that, how institutional theatre has formed, framed this idea of the folk or the idea of the classical for that matter. So I'm not invested there. My idea, my research generally discuss about more kinds of subaltern communities, about the folk culture of the subaltern communities. It has a lot to do with the non-institutionalized kinds of theatre. And from those points of view, I will be discussing that how I see this whole framing, how I see this whole idea of the politics or cultural politics for that matter. And I will be making also some controversial remarks. So maybe So first of all, so one of the observations that I find quite interesting is that what is the whole reason that you have folk keeps reinventing itself. And you never find this challenge of that okay, you are not getting the audience, you are not getting the kinds of artists. So when I was doing my fieldwork during 2010, then I also had this concern that folk is disappearing, artists are not interested, and things are going in a bad way, in a kinds of that light. But later I realized that it's a strong comeback and whole reinvention that is happening constantly, and they are constantly engaging with all formats, all forms, and the idea is. And also the other point is that despite of having all kinds of privilege, having all kinds of ads, why the institutional theatres are failing, and why even living in the margin, surviving on the day-to-day basis, why this folk performance and those traditions are like thriving. And I think what we can learn from those traditions, and that is going to be kinds of like one of the connections that I will try my best to draw here. So first controversial remark is that for all good reasons, I feel that idea of Indian theatre has failed. And I think I am saying this with a kinds of like some kinds of conviction, because if suppose that the way we think about Indian classical dance, the way we think about Indian classical music, at least we don't have Indian classical theatre. Like no, of course one can think about Indian Sanskrit theatre, Sanskrit drama, but in terms of our like now the contemporary evidence, you don't have that kinds of Indian theatre that you can say there is a Indian theatre. And I think that at least in last 20-25 years, for all good reasons, for all kinds of things, I will say that good that Indian theatre has failed, because at least we cannot talk about one nation and one theatre now. Because like no, there is a whole idea of that one nation, one language, one nation and one leader. But again, for all good reasons, we cannot talk about one nation and one Indian theatre. And that's why like I'm saying that it has failed. Also, I'm taking a lot from the way G. Aloysius, the social scientist, he discussed about this idea of the nation and nationalism. And he said that he wrote this book, like very, again, a controversial book. And that at a time, 1996, it was considered one of the very pathbreaking work. It's called Nationalism Without Nation. And this is because you were trying to develop some kinds of cultural theatre, certain kinds of idea of the theatre, which never had this kinds of connection. It never had the kinds of aspirations among people. People could never relate to this idea of the Indian national theatre, or for that matter, Indian theatre as per se. It has borrowed, so there was an invention, a whole lot of innovation has happened in terms of theatre, and there was an idea that you are going to borrow from all cultures. So you are going to borrow, you are going to take some forms from Videshi or Bihar, you are going to take some forms from Tamil Nadu, some form from everywhere, wherever you can take, but despite of all borrowings, it could not sustain itself. So what is the region? What is the kinds of region that you have all the privilege, you can borrow from anywhere you want, and you have certain kinds of cultural legitimacy to do that. But again, despite of all borrowing, all ads, you are feeling time and again. So that we can think about, and I will come back to this question. I will try to reflect on those questions. Second, as Anita was talking about this whole idea of that, how SNA, Sangeet Natak Academy Seminar 1956 has shaped the idea of the folk to that extent. Also, it has shaped this idea of institutional theatre and what is going to be the future of theatre for that matter. What is doing, it's a quite interesting way that if you see there is a kind of two departures are happening. One departure that you have earlier, IPTA. So there is a departure from IPTA where you had certain kinds of radical progressive theatre at a place. So you have a different departure is happening, or the kinds of, I will say, in other words, we can say that how IPTA is now getting institutionalized. How IPTA kinds of the resonance are becoming part of the institution now. And you will find that most of the people who are coming from this background, they have a very progressive lineage, they have a certain kinds of commitment to the cultural politics and things like that, and they are making these kinds of intervention in which IPTA kinds of movement is becoming part of the institution. To that extent, that approach of IPTA also becomes the approach of institution. So this is one thing happening. Second thing is happening, this whole regionalization, that decentralization. But again, this is a kind, whether to say decentralization or whether to say it's kinds of centralization is happening. So interesting dialogue is happening here. So you are trying to break away from so you are trying to approach all regions that, okay, we are going to engage with the regional cultures, you are going to engage with the regional forms, Manipuri theatre, other forms of theatre. But so you are trying to say that we are becoming more decentralized in that sense. But if you see that what has happened, that you are trying to centralize this idea of the folk, you are trying to centralize some idea of theatre, even in their own domains. So now you can talk about Chhau theatre, you can talk about Manipuri theatre, you can talk about different kinds of theatre as a part of the national theatre. So here region and nations are not going against each other. Regions are becoming very much part of the nation, and that has been the kinds of dynamics movement in which this whole idea of the theatre is getting constituted. Also, the way Avasthi, when he's Suresh Avasthi, when he's coming with this idea of the theatre of the roots, or the roots movement for that matter, then again I find a very interesting movement here also. So you have idea of the decolonization. So we are trying to decolonize this colonized idea of the theatre. So we are going to get away with this idea of the script. we are going to get away with this idea of that kinds of like fourth wall idea of the theatre. Our focus is going to be more on actor. Our focus is going to be more on performance for that matter. What he's also doing that he's bringing all idea of the roots. So he's trying to bring this idea of the roots theatre from different regions again. That he's trying to find roots somewhere in regions. But again, the model becomes the Natya Shastra. So one way you are trying to decolonize the theatre, but the other way you are also trying to colonize the theatre. Put in other way, that one way you are trying to, we are decolonizing the theatre that has some waste, like some kinds of interest in, some kinds of investment in realistic kinds of drama, some kinds of invested in interest in kinds of textual kinds of drama. Now you are saying that decolonizing, and that way he was like, that movement was quite successful, because you will see that and at that point of historical juncture, I still acknowledge that that movement played a interesting and kinds of significant role. But what ultimately you are doing, that your format, you are trying to imagine this idea of the regional theatre through the idea of canon of the Natya Shastra, and you are trying to somewhere channelize this whole idea of the regional theatre through this idea of the kinds of canonized idea of the Natya Shastra and that kinds of canon. So one way, if you are putting in a kinds of contemporary context or through the contemporary politics, then one way you have rightly done that you have quite successfully decolonized the theatre from kinds of British, from Western oriented kinds of theatre, but other way you also have colonized the kinds of regional theatre in a kinds of very Sanskrit language, Brahminical language, and that becomes one of the points that we can discuss. And you have interesting reading by, for example, Dharwadkar, and it has been a kinds of, for me, very essentialized kinds of reading. So there was a whole idea that, okay, urban theatre is necessarily modern theatre, urban theatres are necessarily contemporary theatre for that matter, and she has there was a whole discussion. So for example, Habib Tanvir will say that, okay, how he's trying to create, he was trying to see some kinds of conception of Brechtian theatre in Indian folk theatre, and he could see some kinds of dialogue. He could imagine some kinds of archetype there. But here you have so Dharwadkar will say that how some kinds of roots theatre has also created some kinds of revivalism. It is bringing some kinds of revivalism. It is bringing some kinds of traditionalism, and so that was one kinds of reading where so urban theatre is necessarily about modern theatre, and if you are doing folk theatre, then it is necessarily about some kinds of traditional theatre. Now the question we can ask that what was the role of Habib Tanvir there? How we see the play of Habib Tanvir. So whether he was doing traditional theatre, whether he is doing modern theatre, whether he was doing contemporary theatre. And I think that boundary gets challenged here. So for me, what was happening, that there was a kinds of whole engagement with very formalistic kinds of modernism in terms of doing theatre of the roots. So it's a whole formalistic modernism has become a kinds of canon or kinds of conception through which theatre was getting engaged, but there was a lesser and lesser amount of political modernism that was becoming part of that kinds of modernism. And there has been a kinds of erasure of political modernism in this whole idea of the formalistic modernism, and that I will say that is the one departure that is happening around 70s and 80s. So of course, when there has been engagement with different kinds of regional forms, different kinds of folk theatre, then folk forms are also getting reconfigured. It is also getting framed in a certain ways. And now how you are going to discuss folk, and it has again become a kind of very institutionalized lens through which you are going to discuss about folk. And in many states, for example, in Tamil Nadu, wherever you had the kinds of colonial centers, especially in colonial centers, folk has been framed in a different ways. The states which remains outside of the kinds of colonial center that are still maintained some kinds of link with the folk and subaltern communities, folk with the kinds of whole organic, quote unquote, organic connection with the communities. But again, in colonial center, there has been different kinds of appropriation that has happened. So we have examples of Chhau, we have examples of Manipuri, we have examples of, even to that extent, you can discuss about Rabindra Sangeet, Rabindra dance in Bengal, and you have all this new configuration is happening through this very much idea of the folk, and there I will say how folk is getting framed in a kinds of new ways. Another again it can be a controversial point, but to say that how in Indian cultural politics, this whole idea of the modernity and contemporary are used to isolate. This whole idea, whenever we discuss about modernity, certain kinds of modernization, not modernity and contemporary, it has become a kinds of lens and perspective to subsume this whole idea of the subaltern communities folk, or idea of the kinds of different idea of the kinds of other kinds of contemporary performances. So necessarily you have developed this idea of the modern theatre, you have developed this idea of the contemporary theatre to marginalize whole range of theatre. So when we discuss about now, of course, contemporary kinds, contemporaneity, contemporary dance, contemporary theatre has become a kinds of very, I will say that kinds of cutting edge work, but how we are perceiving this idea of the modern and contemporary, how we are framing this idea of the modern contemporary, I think if you see from other vantage point or from other perspective, then modern and contemporary has become a lens to isolate, just to subsume, just to marginalize other different range of performance traditions in India. And that is the way I would like to see that how this idea of the modern theatre, contemporary theatre has become a part of the very elite idea of the theatre, and it has tried in whole conceptualization to somewhere sideline, somewhere to get away, to erase this whole idea of the larger idea of the cultural field, larger idea of the idea of the Indian theatre per se. Now I will come back to this whole idea that what I say that theatre is facing the crisis of language. And I'm saying with some kinds of examples. So 2 years back, sometimes I come to watch some kinds of theatre production, but 2 years back, I was in Kerala, was participating in this international festival, ITFOK, and I decided that I'm going to watch each and every production, just to see that what is happening in theatre field, in modern theatre field. I watched a number of productions, and just and I felt that there is a kinds of some kinds of whole, there is a crisis of language, there is a whole format is same, there is a kinds of drilling kinds of language. People are going to the theatre, people are coming out of the auditorium, and very few production I could have said that were interesting and should have been watched, for that matter. So, but again, if you compare this so this is happening in theatre, but again you can take example of, for example, music. What is happening in music? I think a lot of innovation has happened in music, lot of innovation has happened in dance, lot of innovation is happening, of course, in media and mediatized kinds of art, but I think theatre is somewhere remains astruck. It is not able to develop its own kinds of new kinds of vocabulary. It is not able to break the kinds of languages that it has. So there is some kinds of major crisis I could see that is happening in theatre, and I think unless theatre, Indian theatre for that matter, any theatre is not able to break that language or is not able to come out from that kinds of boundaries, I don't see there is a kinds of hope that is going to bring this idea of that Indian theatre for that matter. I found more interesting, so I went to watch Jallikattu in Tamil Nadu. So you see that whole Jallikattu is a very popular kinds of performance. You can see it's a kinds of a football match is happening, but again protest is happening. So Jallikattu is becoming part of the protest, Jallikattu is happening, and you have kinds of uproar, you have kinds of mobilization, you have kinds of participation. And I think I miss that kinds of energy, I miss that kinds of impulse, I miss that kinds of mobilization in our theatre, and I think that disconnect is quite telling if you are comparing with theatre and larger idea of Jallikattu or that kinds of participations. Coming back to this idea of the theatre and the political, because Zulekha has also pointed me that I should also address this idea of the theatre and political. And so one is that and I, of course, you have now new, so Nikhil is here, I know Neil is doing some interesting work. So of course, new theatre works are happening, and that is quite giving a new language, new forms, new dimension of theatre. But in terms of kinds of political engagement, and how to map this idea of the political engagement, that whether theatre is political or not. Of course, we can say that every theatre is political, every form has some kinds of politics in it. So that way, it's all theatre has some kinds of politics to make or say. But I will recognize the kinds of time we are located now, the kinds of politics that is happening around us. Unless theatre is not getting attacked, unless theatre is not getting banned, I will still be hesitant to say that it is political enough. And so let us see in last 10 years, which were the theatre kinds of group that was attacked, banned, and kinds of thing. And we have examples from Delhi University Theatre Group. We have examples of course, I work on Gadar and Jannat Mandi, and the kinds of attack they have seen, kinds of brutality they have seen. And it is again saying that political, of course, some of the theatres remains quite very, very political, but how to see this idea of the politics, I will see through this idea of that kinds of how a state is responding to theatre, how authority is responding to your theatre, how authority is responding to your art. And that way I would like to read this idea of the political theatre, because of course we are remaining in a kinds of staying in a time where the things political is becoming very, very volatile, and I think theatres cannot remain outside of these kinds of volatility. It cannot remain outside of these kinds of violence. There is a whole now new work is happening about this idea of the prison theatre is becoming another kinds of very, that kinds of new idea of the theatre, many times therapeutic, many times kinds of say political idea of the theatre. But I will read it in a different way. I think unless theatre is not going into prison, we can say prison theatre, but it should be other way around, that unless theatre is not becoming part of that kinds of other way, unless theatre is not getting arrested, or unless theatre is not getting prisoned in that sense, I think we also are missing that kinds of cutting or kinds of edges of the politics of the theatre for that matter. So I remember so Habib Tanvir was in JNU, he was speaking in JNU, I still remember very vividly, and he was quite old that time, and he said that he will have cigar, and after that he was making this statement that I wish to have a dictatorship. And after that he was almost for a moment he was silent. And we all were thinking that what happened to him, why he's saying that we wish to have a dictatorship and fascism. And this is we can say that, okay, my God, maybe he wanted to say something and he is saying something. And after that he said that, so our theatre can continue. We have to have dictatorship so our theatre can continue. I think maybe that a spirit is missing. A spirit may be happening in some theatre halls, in gallery, but unless it is not becoming part of the kinds of bigger mobilization, and that I have seen in Telangana, that how you have purges of CRPA, purges of kinds of police forces, on theatre is happening, songs are happening, and the dynamics that you could have seen, the energy that you could have seen, I think remains missing, and somewhere that is why theatre also remains somewhere weakening its own kinds of language. Where I see the possibilities. So of course I see the possibility not in ads, that whether, so there has been whole discourse that how institutions should provide some ads so theatre can survive. Institutions could provide some kinds of facilitate some kinds of a space to preserve those kinds of theatre. It's all right, I am not going against that, but at the same time I don't think ads supports are going to bring back theatre. Only social movements, only kinds of political movements, only theatre, when theatre is becoming part of the political movement, when theatre and politics is becoming part of theatre, only that is the dialogue through, I think that theatre can come back. We have examples, and I'm giving you one example from Telangana. I can give you another example from Maharashtra, because I see a kinds of renaissance of theatre, theatre renaissance is happening in Marathi theatre. Marathi theatre is witnessing a kinds of renaissance that at least I don't find in other language, in other forms of theatre. And I will just will give you one example. So I think 6 months back, I was watching one group from Vidarbha region, and they were doing theatre. And it was about a new kinds of experiment, new engagement, but something amazing to see. So you have widows, Vidarbha, widows from Vidarbha, they are participating in theatre. What this group was doing, that they this widow will come and tell their own stories. And I went to see the rehearsal. I could not watch the rehearsal because many times they will collapse on the stage. They will tell the story, they will collapse on the stage. But at the same time, this whole idea that yes, we will present our story, we are going to tell our story, and that was the commitment, and where I saw the new language, new force, or new commitment to the theatre. And I think if we are moving in those directions, then I think still there is a hope. Also in Maharashtra, other things is happening, that you have whole competition that is going on, and so the people who organize this competition, they have some kinds of limitation. So you cannot repeat the script, you cannot repeat the production, and therefore you have whole new authors, new young writers, they are writing new theatres, their part is doing all kinds of things, and that is the way I can see that how Marathi theatre, despite of all kinds of crises, is able to create its own language, is able to make its own kinds of idioms, and some kinds of, I will say, departure. Yeah, so okay, so let me end with this things that I'm not so much concerned about theatre. because that has been a kind of like many times concerned that okay, theatre activists, theatre institutions should be concerned about theatre. Unless theatre is not concerned about us, I am not concerned about theatre. And with this statement, I would like to end here. Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you, Anita and Brahma Prakash. Nikhil, can we just, I'd just like to open it out in case anybody has some questions, comments.
I'll just project over here. My comment is posed to Asha. So when you're talking about the idea of decentralizing, but at the same event you are actually centralizing within the space of Brahmin hegemony. Now, I would very controversially play devil's advocate here.
Yeah.
To say that, my exposure to Yakshagana came forth through a play that's called Akshabdara, which is performed by this group called Brahma, which is very active in Bangalore and in Karnataka per se. And the problems that we look at through how the appropriation of a folk performance structure is taken on by a woman or by a group of people who are from upper class, caste, or privileged space. The play, in fact, it's approached in a sense that it's dismantled certain gender, the binary that has existed within Yakshagana, because here you see Cherian playing a man role within the performance piece, and the man within the sphere, he plays the woman's role, and the entire discourse is put into a form of the Urbi Yakshagana Kendra's musicians coming forth and taking on certain folk tales and folk stories to lead the audience through the piece. So, I mean, I completely understand, I completely empathize as well with what you've said, especially with how performance spaces are treated in the world today, in our country today. But I also feel it's also given a sort of a sense of exposure to beyond the classical forms that are dependent in the urban spaces. Because up until when I'd seen it when I was probably 17 or 18, I had no idea of how Sanskritized Bharatanatyam became from Sadhana, and Yakshagana is still in many forms, still in many aesthetic practices, especially in the Urbi faction, is still part of the Sadhana practice as opposed to taking on the other forms that are various other spaces in Tulunadu and in Karnataka and others.
Yeah. So thank you so much. Like at least if you are thinking in terms of gender, context of gender, then you are right, and I would like to agree with you that it has given a kind of newer space for opening a space for women. Because if you are thinking about more traditional kinds of theatre, then maximum you had a space for female impersonator and all these people, they will do the theatre. So, of course, when I am talking about cultural appropriation, then cultural appropriation is not always a kind of, I would say, is a kind of so of course, it is many times done by elites. But what is happening that you will also see that second wave of cultural appropriation is happening in many places. So, for example, in Tamil Nadu. So earlier you have certain kinds of appropriation that has been happened done by upper caste elites. But now the people who are coming from those communities, and not only for those communities, it is becoming more diverse, where other communities can also participate. They can also have and in that way you can also see that how gender, especially women are also participating on those performances, and the ground was the earlier appropriation. So also many places in many times it has opened a new kinds of a space. And when I'm talking about this cultural appropriation, I'm not only talking about some kinds of very negative values, but yes, on what cost? On what kinds of cost, in what kinds of erasure, in what kinds of new values that you are creating, and even in terms of materiality, the body that you are bringing. So we can discuss about larger context in which this cultural appropriation is taking place. So agree with you.
Anyone else?
My question is related towards you. So the question would be a bit from the context that I personally am a theatre actor, and with three of us are from National School of Drama. In the course of 3 years, I'm a third-year student actor. There are different genres of theatre that we are familiarized with, starting from realism to classical theatre to farce to extreme realism, hyper-realism, and all the sorts. So this being a national institute, it kind of makes us, it's offering us a platter wherein you make to think that you are familiarized with all sorts of. There's folk theatre as well. There's a whole session when we are taken to another state and then made familiar with the folk theatre from that particular state. When we went to Gujarat and did Bawai. So I feel as a student and as an actor, which is not in most of the cases given enough emphasis as somebody who is capable of directing a particular vision or a particular political, and we're not held responsible for most of the statements that the play makes. It's rather the director. So and most of the times we're made to feel like that also. So it's not a complaint, it's just the fact that I've noticed as an actor. So the statement that you made that if a particular play is not banned or if it's not political enough. So coming from a national institute wherein politics has a major role to play, everything that institution holds from the academics to the will counter to the canteen wherein politics is widely discussed, there somehow is a tendency for the school in itself to neutralize the content and the politics of the play or the subjects that we deal with. Extremely important subjects which they quote and unquote say that very relevant and contemporary topics that we deal with. So as actors, when after 3 years we come out from such an environment wherein the politics of the whole situation is neutralized and you're made to fear that the consequences that you might face, how do you think as actor, and I'm specifically speaking from that perspective, how do we, how do we get back into the world with a very strong political vision? Because I could be a communist, I could be another person believing in a particular ideology. So how do I bring about that kind of a change or a responsible change in us?
I think the question could be put to both of you.
Yeah, this is for both of us here.
No, why don't you address it? I have something to say, but...
Yeah, I think when I came to take a few classes for your batch, so I remember very vividly that this whole engagement with the folk and all those kinds of contexts, and you're rightly pointing out that there has been a whole attempt to even it's not just about NSD, it's about major institutions that comes directly under different kinds of lenses and things, so things becomes quite difficult. So I'm not necessarily saying that how within the institution one should work, but what about after that, after the institutional life, what kinds of life and what kinds of engagement you have. So somewhere theatre and kinds of NSD theatre is becoming part of the festival, and that is my big worry, that it is not able to get out of that kinds of festival space. So wherever you going to see, so either go to Kerala, come to Delhi, it's largely the festival space. And I think that one kinds of movement one can do, and many people, I will say NSD pass out, they are doing the kinds of engaging with the local, doing kinds of interesting work, and so of course that is no denying of that. But point is that largely it is becoming a part of the same kinds of setup, same kinds of engagement, same sorts of people, same audience. And but again I see, so for example I will give you another example. So Guru Saran Singh, I was talking about Guru Saran Singh, again he is a major figure in Punjab, person coming from theatre. He's done quite remarkable theatre in Punjab, many times very radical theatre in Punjab. Now they organize this Mela in the name of Guru Saran Singh, and we see that people from all walk of life, either politics, lawyer, all sorts of people, they come to, they could be mobilized in the name of Guru Saran Singh. So while Guru Saran Singh is able to mobilize so many walks of life people, but while kinds of many other kinds of directors or actors, they are not able to do that sorts of work. So I think there has not been engagement, that kinds of engagement, and that kinds of engagement with maybe community, even within the Delhi. Ask, just go out of our own setup and see that, do you know NSD? Do you know what they do? So they may be even knowing, but again, in terms of engagement, I don't think there is a kind of whole missing link that remains there. And I think that could be bridged. That can be bridged. Yeah. I don't think
She wants to know how it can be bridged.
Because we're familiarized with everything, but we're not familiar with anything. So, and I'm not blaming the institution per se, but wherever we go, I'm from Kerala. Probably it's colonizing theatre in another way, like you mentioned. Taking fragments from all the different genres of theatre, and then you're made to believe that you know what the Indian theatre is. And then you look back after the whole production, and then you see you probably do not know as much as they, they said.
See, I'm not going to address the question that you are raising of like, what does the actor do after he or she steps out? And I'm saying this only because I'm not an actor, I'm not part of that economy, and so I do not feel able to kind of venture into that. But what I will say about what you are saying is the way in which a certain kind of template has been set up by the project of institutionalizing. And that template is very much about different kinds of aesthetic idioms or ideas that you as actors are supposed to embody. And in embodying those idioms, you are actually embodying the nation. And I think what is interesting in the question that you raised and the question that you're raising is this kind of tension that we are seeing here, which is of like, one, the politics of institutionalizing, and two, the politics of mobilizing. And when you think about the politics of institutionalizing and the politics of mobilizing, to me, it's a question of what is the politics of mobilizing under neoliberalism? What is the politics of institutionalizing under neoliberalism? And maybe I'm cynical, but I think that a large part of mobilizing today is institutionalized. I do not know, it's also because I do not have the field work that Brahma Prakash has. I will acknowledge that. I'm not saying that there are no possibilities. I'm just saying that mobilizing is increasingly institutional. It's increasingly about funding. If you just look at the way in which the government is acting today, they're basically looking to see where your money is coming from and what you're doing with that money. So any kind of money that is being directed towards social activities is actually questionable. So in terms of like, so I think that there has to be some kind of a conversation between mobilizing. I do not see mobilizing as existing in a terrain of its own. And I do think that the desire to institutionalize is something, to institutionalize in particular forms, is something that is very much a part of the kind of neoliberal framework in which we find ourselves. So you will have actors, you will have dancers, you will, and Zulekha and I were talking about this, that why is it that theatre falls out of all this? There's visual art, there's music, there's photography. These are capitalized forms. Theatre is not capitalized. And I always tell people, the moment they say, okay, we need to find like ways of supporting ourselves, I'm saying theatre is and always has been a poor form. You should know better than anybody else where do NSD actors find their jobs. And when you think about mobilizing, either, I don't know how many of us can mobilize as a way of life.
I don't know if I have a question or a comment, but I just wanted to ask all three of you if you followed TikTok or Vlog, because these are
I don't. I have
open forms. They're really interesting open forms, and some things that you are saying kind of are happening there. For the government to shut down TikTok is interesting. Why could the government why would it even want to shut down TikTok? What is this TikTok content? And now now regions are developing their own apps. So Bengal has one now, which is Vlog or something like that. You can see traditional forms of theatre or theatrics being played out. Very, very much aesthetics of the poor, as in the arte povera sort of, where things are put together and then performances are, God knows who these performances are for.
That's and who they're being done by.
Well, you know who's it being done by, because they are self, it's like, it's not a selfie, but it's a self-performance. But clearly the performance is not for the self, but there's a ritualization to it. And then there is a circulation and a mobilization through a form which is now accessible to to own. For example, just by numbers.
Sorry, Vishal. I'm really sorry.
No,
Can
I just wanted to open that as a point, not as a question.
I'm only in a hurry to wrap this up, and we can really maybe carry this on outside because there is a show and that audience is already here. So thank you, Nikhil, for hosting this talk. And I look forward to the next one, and perhaps we will give you and your actors enough time to set up. Thank you so much for coming.
Yeah, thank you so much,
Thank you.
everyone. Thank you, Zulekha and the